Hey everyone, it's super exciting to have you all here today. Welcome to the channel. This is Bad Magic. When we're here, we like to talk about lots of different things: spirituality, skepticism, gender, pretty much whatever I feel like. So check out some of my other stuff and see if you'd be interested in subscribing. But today I do have a special treat for you. This is the channel's first ever interview, so we're super excited to have a special guest here today. Um, I am a pretty skeptical person and talk a lot about skepticism. That's pretty much more the angle of my channel. But the guest today is going to be talking a little bit of how we can, or I guess we're going to be having a conversation about how to find value in spirituality. Yeah, I'm sure sometimes, we can have a difficult time, especially if we've come from a challenging space with religion in the past. Learning how to kind of have a healthy relationship with spirituality is important. So that's what we're going to do today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Hamilton. Hello, Brian.
Hello. How are you?
Doing fantastic. So Brian, would you mind just introducing yourself, share your name and pronouns, and just what you do, who you are?
So my name's Brian Hamilton. I'm a therapist associate at LifeSource Affordable Counseling in Riverside. Pronouns are he or she, whichever one makes you feel comfortable. So reason I'm on the show is because I saw your last one, and
Cool.
And I'm trying to remember how we connected. It was somehow on Facebook. But you reached out to me and sent me like a link to your page, and I've really enjoyed like our discussions, like in like the Facebook comments and so on. And so hello, Hollis. So I reached out because one of the things that I talked to you about was that I have seen, I see what you're saying about how there is kind of this lack of appreciation, and respect for the scientific community on kind of the religious, from the religious community. But I've kind of seen also the same on the other side, where there's just like, there are certain members of the, scientific community who almost have disdain, for anything that, that even kind of has the whiff of, religiosity about it. And so I wanted to kind of talk about and say, like kind of from my perspective, like how I've seen there can be value in that, while at the same time, myself being somebody who's very like scientifically minded and has a great deal of respect for, for that, that way of thinking. So
like I think being able to have someone show how to have like a level-headed approach with this stuff is really important. And I also think that because when I watch things, I really love to watch like skeptical content, but it is hard to kind of like see it and hold on to kind of like the spiritual value, especially like books like The God Delusion, you know what I mean? With that kind of title, it communicates something about what they believe, about the person believing in God.
Right.
So yeah, and I think some of those things might be unfair, I guess. So I want to know a little bit more, Brian, about your personal background. Like, you have a background in like religious stuff, just tell me about your story.
Yeah. So
spirituality.
Kind of the way I came to spirituality was late in high school. Actually, it was I don't know if you remember the movie Contact with Sigourney Weaver. It was a film that was based on a book that Carl Sagan written. It was a science fiction book of all things, about they find a message from the star Vega, that is basically telling them how to build a machine that can travel, to someplace else, and they don't know where, they don't know what its exact purpose is, but they decide to build it, right? And a lot of what's happening in that film is there is this question of like faith versus science. And so not Sigourney Weaver, it's Jodie Foster, I apologize, and Matthew McConaughey. But anyway, so the whole film is about kind of this situation, and at the end of the film, Jodie Foster's character has a moment where she's confronted with this idea of like her own thoughts about faith, and kind of has a moment when she sort of takes a, you know, like a compromising step between the two of the world of science and the world of faith. And that kind of started me off. And I also had friends who were, you know, Christian at the time, and they were trying to convert me. And I don't know if you've ever had anybody who's, you know, like tried to convert you to another. Yeah. Yes, Hollis, my apologies. I can't believe I messed that up. It's my favorite film, but I can't anyway. But yes, what I did was I actually started going on, you know, and looking at other religious faiths, including like Christianity, Hinduism, Islam. And what you may, if you've ever had an experience with people who are trying to convert you, right, there's a lot of stuff that they're giving you that sounds really lovely and wonderful, and you want to, you know, and you kind of want to embrace it. But then there's this one thing that they like absolutely insist that you have to believe in. You know, like the earth is 6,000 years old, or you have to believe in reincarnation, or whatever it happens to be, that you're just like, I cannot go there.
Yeah.
And so then you kind of, you know, so then I would lose interest and move on to something else. But I've always loved like mythology. I've always loved religion. I've always loved those stories. I eventually came to Buddhism, and it was the first time I'd ever encountered a religion where it was, you know, or a religious belief. And I think it's mostly my church. It's not true of like all of Buddhism, but basically it was that like
what Buddhism church are you part of? Just
is Orange County Buddhist Church, and it's a form of Shin Buddhism, which is a Japanese form of Buddhism. They kind of the idea is that there's a character named Amida Buddha who is kind of like a god-like deity, and he creates a place called the Pure Land for those who aren't able to achieve nirvana here. They can go there and achieve nirvana. And the church where I attend, looks at that more from like a metaphorical perspective. And so the idea is that like there's even a poem by a guy named Saichi, which talks about like how the Pure Land and hell are both here in this world. And that basically our perspective on things is what makes us, makes it hell, or, the Pure Land. And so he says, like hell is right here, and the Pure Land is right here. And it's my perception that makes it so. But anyway, that was the first time I'd ever encountered a religious belief where it was like, where they were like, try this, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, try something else. And I was like, what? And so then I kind of learned more about it, and I got into like things like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and then that just like meshed with all of my beliefs about like science and religion and mythology, and and so now I am where I am today.
Wow, that's super, super awesome. So if I'm understanding correctly, like you were not really spiritual or religious, and then the movie really kind of like started opening your eyes. Did it make you like curious about like spirituality, or curious about your faith?
What it did initially was it kind of got me more along the science path. Because I went out and I bought like all of Carl Sagan's books. Like I got Cosmos and Demon Haunted World and Billions and Billions and Contact, of course, and some of his lesser known ones that I can't think of at the moment, Brokaw's Brain. And so I became really fascinated with him. One of the things that I love about his writing is that he has an almost like spiritual awe that's associated with science. And so I love the way like the book Pale Blue Dot opens, which is this idea that like they took a picture of Earth as one of the Voyager probes was leaving the solar system, and they turn it back around, and it's basically tiny little pixel that's like a pale blue dot. And it just happened that like there was like a sunbeam that kind of caught it right then. And so basically what he says is, that's us, that's home, that's here, and everyone you know and everyone you love, and everyone you'll ever know, is somewhere on that dot. And all of the, and all the wars that we've ever fought, have all been over a fraction of that dot.
Yeah.
And I love that. Like, it just gives you this sense of like awe and humility, and just, that, like, I feel like that's what religion is supposed to bring. And so much of the time what happens with religious, with religious leaders is they bring it as certainty. Like, we're supposed, like, this is how things are. The world is 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
There was a literal Garden of Eden. Whatever it happens to be, there's a literal Amida Buddha. Whatever it happens to be, and by doing that, we kind of, it loses that same sense of awe, that same sense of wonder, that mystery that kind of comes with it. And that's what I loved about Carl Sagan. And so I have sort of that same sort of religious awe for science because of like reading his stuff. And I felt like a lot of times in his writings, like even in Demon Haunted World, he says, like, I think that there will one day come a time where there is a religion that does have that respect for science and somehow finds a way to incorporate it into their beliefs. And I think, and I think he even talks about like meeting with the Dalai Lama, and he was the one spiritual leader where he said, like, if something in science proved definitively that something was wrong with your religious, religious beliefs, how would you handle that? And most religious leaders would kind of hem and haw about it and sort of hedge on it. And the Dalai Lama was the first one that he encountered who said, then the religious views would have to change.
Yeah, that's like literally mind blowing coming from like a different perspective. Like to have anyone who, a religion that's based on kind of the scientific method of like, this is what we know for now. Like, this is kind of like what we figured out. Like, things can change if like new evidence shows up. And I think that openness there is also really important. I think closing yourself off can be, I don't know, you can miss out on things if you feel closed off.
Yeah. And one of the things like kind of that you and I had talked about when we were first discussing doing the show was this idea that there's a kind of a myth or not a myth, but like a parable in Buddhism. And it's just described as kind of a Buddhist monk pointing at the moon. And the idea behind it is that a lot of times what happens is that religious truth is like the finger pointing at the moon,
right?
And kind of pointing you towards like that sense of wisdom, that sense of insight, that sense of divinity. But what tends to happen a lot of times is in religion is we mistake the finger for the moon. And so what happens is we focus on this and we lose sight of what is divine. And Emerson even goes on and talks about like these lenses that we see the divine through, and they color our perception of it. They let us see a part of it, but not the full part of it. And it's kind of similar to like the Hindu belief, like the Hindu parable of like the four monks who are like feeling different parts of the elephant.
The blind monks with the elephant.
And and at the same time making those mistakes about what things are. But it's kind of this idea that like religion is this, it's myth, it's metaphor, it's symbol, and it's pointing you at something that's important. But when we look at that one thing, as like the literal truth, when we're looking at that finger, we're missing out on like the bigger picture. And so like, to give an example, like if you've ever read like I don't know if you've ever, a lot of times creationists will point to Job, because they'll say that like in chapter 40, there's this description that sounds very much like a brontosaurus, right? I pulled it up and I thought I'd read it because he says, look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox, what strength it has in its loins, and what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze, and its limbs are made of rods of iron. Ranks first among the works of God, yet its maker can approach it with its sword, right? It sounds like there's a lot of things in there, like these big trunk-like legs, this like whip-like tail, right? It's herbivorous. And so you kind of like, it sounds like a brontosaurus. They point to that a lot of times as kind of like, see, dinosaurs lived alongside humans, right?
Yeah.
And, and one of the things that kind of happens in that is if you read the next chapter, he talks about Leviathan, which is this
Right.
massive, like world-sized serpent that encircles the world, right? And he describes it as having like, scales that are like shields, and it breathes fire and all of these other things. And like, there's no dinosaur that we have ever found that looks anything like this. And it's certainly not anything that's like the size of the world, right?
Right.
But what you miss when you're looking at it from that little perspective is the whole point of Job, which is that like
Right.
the story is basically, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's about Satan, and God are up in heaven, and God's like pointing down. He's like, there's my buddy Job down there, and he's my best worshiper, right? And he loves me, unconditionally. And Satan basically says to him, well, that's because you give him everything. Yeah. And you take that away, you take away all the things, all the gifts you've given him, and he would curse your name. And God basically says, want to bet? And Satan says, sure. And so Satan, and God, they kind of come up with like the limits of this, and Satan's, and so like God says, you can do whatever you want, just you can't kill him, so so Satan goes down and he kills his livestock first, and and Job is still devout. He kills off Job's family, and Job is still devout. Eventually he gives like Job this like sickness, this disease that like breaks out pustules on his face and everything. And his friends are coming like, man, Job, you must have done something really bad to get all of this to happen. He's like, no, nothing. I didn't do anything. And then he turns to God and he says, amongst other things, he's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's when God kind of comes back and like, kind of rebuffs him. And there's, and it's kind of like, dude, God, that's harsh. But it kind of puts Job back in his place. And, and then after this whole experience, God gives him the things back, like, and he comes through. But the whole point of this story, like within the truest tradition, is to question, to ask these weird, like these questions of like, is God really a good God? Like, is he all seeing, all knowing? Like, does he really have our best interests in mind? Like, why do bad things happen to good people? And part of the way that we know that this idea, like we're supposed to question God, is that Christ himself asked that question. My God, why hast thou forsaken me, when he's on the cross? So questioning is such an important part. Doubt is such an important part of religion. And you're losing that when you're taking it as literal truth and saying that, you have to believe that this is, that dinosaurs lived on Earth. Like, no, you don't. Doubt is part of it.
I think like we're very uncomfortable with doubt, and Hollis mentioned that like we act like we can ultimately explain everything, even though it's not true. We feel comfortable when we can explain stuff, even if we have the wrong explanation.
Right.
That makes us feel better.
Right.
Like we will fight really hard to feel confident about something. Like me, like I fought really hard to know that I was going to go to heaven.
Right.
And I really wanted to know, so I would convince myself that like everything I did would be enough for that or whatever. Because that would make me more comfortable and secure.
Right.
But as you were speaking, I had another thought that I think is important is really important to have. Like when you're dealing with a person who maybe has come from religion and maybe is struggling to kind of get back into spirituality, oftentimes like the name God, the word God, can be very unsettling and things like that.
Yes.
And I'm curious about one, like just your general thoughts, and like two, even in that story, the story of Job and like questioning God, how can a person who maybe like that concept doesn't work for them, how could they learn from that story? How could they pull value from a story like that?
Oh, wow. No, that's a good point. And I think a lot of it is just kind of understanding that we live our lives by story. Whether you're religious or not, And so that story, even if you don't know it, even if you don't live by it, it somehow shapes our culture. And so understanding that like this is part of who we are, and trying to figure it out kind of from that perspective, but also kind of recognizing like, what are the stories you're living your life by? And because there are
Right.
people who like absolutely, they're like, yeah, I reject God. I reject the biblical teachings because it's harsh. There is this kind of sense of like good and evil, this dichotomy that really isn't the way the world works. And when we get into that
Mm.
mindset, a lot of times it does create violence and distrust and hatred towards other people. And so knowing that, you can say like, yeah, I'm not going to be part of that. That's not okay.
Yeah.
But I still see it. I still understand how it fits in the world. But also, even if you've kind of rejected that, there are things that are stories that you are telling yourself um, that do shape how you live your life. And like all of us,
Right.
as an example, like money, like we tell ourselves that it has value, that we can exchange it for things that are valuable,
Yeah.
and meaningful in our lives. And we organize our lives around this fiction that we've essentially created, and created a whole philosophy, of economics,
Right.
based around this idea that money has value.
Yeah.
And so, like anybody who's, has any kind of fandom that they're really devoted to, like
Yeah.
you can feel it too, is that like you go to conventions, you dress up as your favorite characters, you write fan fiction about it. You're taking those characters, you're taking those people, those individuals, and making meaning out of them,
Okay.
and shaping your worldview around it. And
Yeah.
so I kind of think like when it comes to religion, like even if you decide that like that like
Mm.
Christianity or Judaism or any of the Judeo-Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, you don't want to live by that, still kind of take a look at your life and go like, what are the stories that shape
Yeah. Okay.
my life, and how am I engaging with them in a way that makes, that gives my life meaning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And I think you're exactly right. I think that storytelling is a very unique, like, evolutionary, like, biological, like, miracle that we're able to do. Like,
Mhm.
obviously, I'm not sure. I don't know if other
Yeah.
animals have like this capacity to pass on stories like us.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a good question, and I
I
don't
don't
know. I mean, a
know.
lot of times when we look at animals, like just kind of like from like a psychological perspective, they tend to be very like literal, like kind of
Yeah.
concrete thinking. Like their communication is about like, there's a predator over there, guys. Be
Right.
careful. There, and like even like crows, they can even tell you like there's a predator over there with a red shirt on, and a Richard Nixon
Yeah.
mask.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
um, but I wanted to kind of, yeah, Hollis pointed out something. Admittedly, the God of the Old Testament was pretty do what I say and do it right next, or get smote. And what's interesting is that like the Gnostics recognized that when they were talking about, like, if you read like their writings on God and their creation myth,
Oh yeah.
God is actually like
Yeah.
their God is this sort of separate entity, this
Mm.
divinity who kind of exists outside of time and space and knowledge, essentially, and and has like his divine light, um, kind of gives birth to other gods. And one of them was a female goddess. I want to say her name was Sophia. Don't quote me on that. Hollis, you can correct me if you know, because like it was Sigourney Weaver. Oh gosh. Anyway, but she gave birth to a deity outside, without his divine permission. Essentially,
Mhm.
she wanted to create something of her own, and that deity was Samael, and that's the God of the Old Testament. That's the God that created. And
Interesting.
when he first came into being, he thought he was alone, and he says this aloud. And the greater deity says, "You were wrong, Samael. You're not alone. You are
Yeah.
not the supreme being, right?" But he creates the world, and the world is flawed because he's flawed. And
Yeah.
so what their idea was that Christ came and basically was saying like, yeah, this is not a God that you should be worshiping. You should be worshiping this other one. And I'm here to bring that deity's
Yeah.
message to you, and get you out of this hellscape essentially that the
Yeah.
other one created.
Would
Um,
you? And I feel like I have, like, I would say, dabbled, stuck my toe into Gnostic texts,
mhm.
and I I think that they had more of like an understanding of heaven and hell as more of like a present thing, kind of like
Mhm.
the kingdom of heaven is at hand type of a
Mm.
situation rather than a real hell. I'm not sure, but do you
Yeah,
remember?
there's not a lot we know about quite what the Gnostics believed, except just kind of
Yeah.
the writings that they found in like Nag Hammadi library. You can there's a great if you go on YouTube, there's a great YouTube channel called Altrusion Grace Media, and
Okay.
they do like a narration of a lot of the writings of from the Gnostics
Okay.
that they've
Cool.
discovered. And so there are people who kind of have devoted themselves to trying to revive those beliefs and teach, those spiritual practices. Obviously we don't really know what they did or practiced, but
Yeah.
just what they wrote.
Right.
um all this, yes, it sounds like retconning. Yes, absolutely. Those old things don't have meaning anymore, so we're retconning it and making it so that it has meaning again. Yes. I love that. Yes. Old Testament retcon.
Yeah.
So,
Like
but
the idea of stories
mm,
and our life being run by stories. I just wanted to jump back to that
yeah.
because I think that's really, really important. Um, yeah, I think that this is a really unique capacity that we have as humans.
Mhm.
And the other thing about stories is like I think our own stories can run our lives. And I think the way my brain is making this connection is through memories that we
Mm,
have of our own lives and how
mm,
even like the stories we tell about our own memories
right,
can even impact what we remember about
right,
memories and how we
right.
formulate memories
Yeah.
as well. And so like we're always pretty much constantly being influenced by stories. So what you're saying is like the way that we kind of like reckon with this, if you're a person who kind of is like really resistant to the idea of God, is like kind of questioning the stories you're running your life by and trying
Mhm.
to evaluate whether or not they're useful or something like that. Is that kind of what you're
Right.
communicating?
Yeah, and I think also just kind of being open to stories and kind of recognizing how they impact you, because it's not just religion. Like there's a movie that I hate, I abhor this movie, but it's a great example. Is The Faculty. It's a
Okay.
horror film, and there's a scene in it where the characters are all kind of like they've realized that there's aliens that are taking over their school, and they're trying to figure out a way, like a way to identify them and also a way to kind of kill them off. And they figure out that there's some drug that one of the characters can make that is lethal to these aliens. And so if they take it, then they die, right? So they're kind of putting together plans in it. And there's a couple of the characters that are there that are also aliens. Um, and one of them's like from out of town, and the other one is like, I think she's Asian. She's some girl of color, but there's so much that's going on in that scene, which is this idea that conformity is an example of what makes you alien, what makes you like a threat, which makes you
Huh.
bad, right? And it's kind of rebelling against society is what makes us good, because all the
Hmm.
characters are kind of like the misfits, the ones that kind
Yeah.
of like fallen out of society, right? Drugs are how you can tell if you're human. You should
Yeah.
fear anybody who is foreign.
Hmm.
And and all of these messages are coming through in this one scene.
Hmm.
And so knowing how to interpret stories and knowing that we're getting these messages that are really terrifying. I'm trying to remember the guy who was the producer, who kind of was the Me Too movement, who was just recently like indicted for sexually molesting
Huh.
multiple women. He's the producer of that film, by the way.
Very nice.
Yes. But those are the kinds of things, is knowing what stories are shaping your life.
Wow.
Um, and I'm a big Star Trek fan, and so I think of like when you look at the Star Trek reboot that they did, there's this whole thing where they strike Vulcan and like implode it with this thing called red matter. But what it is it's a fear. It's the fears of 9/11.
Hmm.
Like we've struck something in the Federation that we never thought would ever be hurt, and it's gone now.
Yeah.
And now we have to reconcile with that.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of that kind of like raw Americanism that kind of came through in that film, like the, we're the good guys and we're going to take out the evil Romulans. And there's something terrifying about that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And so noticing those stories and making sure that we're taking the right meaning out of them.
Like this conversation is so important because, and I want to keep it in the context of like spirituality, right?
Yes.
But for a quick thing, like
Yeah.
I watched this video today that was, I forget what it was called, but it's something about like we're constantly being lied to. And it's just about how like misinformation is spreading so fast. I can't really go a day on the internet without seeing someone saying that like eating yogurt is going to kill me, or like I have parasites, and like you know what I mean? Like all of these different stories you're hearing about, like whatever. You don't know who's telling you the truth, what they're being motivated by. So people need to learn to be able to like take in information and be like, interesting information. Let's see what we want to do with this, rather than like believing everything. But that does kind of help me hop into this question that Hollis asked, which is important. How we know what the truth is then, and wishing that I wish that we could teach ourselves to not care so much. And that's a really good question. And I struggled with this for a long time. I've even like written down that I have had a complicated relationship with truth. And I think when I moved from like Christianity to New Age, I was kind of like very much like truth is super relative. Truth is kind of like whatever you want it to be. There really is no ultimate truth. We have no idea what's going on anywhere. But after I moved into more of like a skeptical zone, I realized that there were some flaws in my logic at the time. And for example, there are things that we can kind of establish as truths. Like, for example, I think I mentioned this in another video, like, I don't know what's in this ball without like cutting it open and figuring it out. Like, that will help me find the evidence, right? If I hold something in here and I'm like, guess what's in here, right? You can guess all you want. We can speculate all we want about what's in here, but we're only going to find out if we open this thing up. So there are things that we can't look inside, right? We can't understand right now. Or kind of the way that we're understanding is like too big for us at the time, at this moment. And maybe that'll change as we evolve as a species. But I think like being able to I think there is like the truths that are important for you and your very specific life, but there are also these truths that that it would be useful if we all kind of like agreed on in some situations. Like, for example, I say that like I was very much influenced by the belief that like I was going to be zapped from the earth and taken up. I could give a shit about climate change. You know what I mean? Because
the world was going to end.
All up, and the world's going to end, and God's going to do the new earth. So like, if we had similar views in terms of like there is a threat to our planet, and like we cared, that would change a lot about the way people interact or whatever. So that's why truth is important. That's why like coming to a place of like not just listening to what people are saying and deciding like, that feels good, I want to believe that, but being like, no, some of these things like actually kind of matter. But at the same time, everyone has the right to like live their life in the way that they want to. Like you could go live in a yurt in the forest by yourself for forever alone and never care about climate anything. And but for me,
until it affects the forest that you're living in. But yes.
The forest fire to burn the ground. But like that's why truth is important. I think that it's important to care about truth. Me caring about truth was part of me like liberating myself and having groundedness in reality and knowing like, gravity is a real thing. Like it's not made up, at least in the way that we understand it right now. And I understand that like gravity, like even the way that we understand gravity is the way that we're able to conceptualize it right now. So that might change in the future as we gain more intelligence or whatever. But I don't have any knowledge about the universe, like atmospheric anything. So I'm not going to trust my judgment on what the atmosphere is. You know what I don't have any of that research. So I would kind of
Yeah.
kind of be like, I'm going to trust your authority because you know about this area, and I'm going to
Right.
trust my authority on things like my body
Right.
and
Yeah.
what I eat. You know what I mean? Like those types
Yeah.
of have
And I
control.
think, yeah, for me, the way I kind of came at it initially, which it's interesting because the thing that kind of got me down the science path initially was actually a quote from the Bible, and it's all over the Bible.
Really?
It's he who has ears, let him hear. And the way that I interpreted that was this idea of that if you're open to it, if you listen to, if you like keep your ears open and keep your mind open and just listen, the truth will come. Like you'll get it, it'll come to you in some way. And so
Yeah.
as an, like what, like I had a friend of mine, her father had passed away. And they read a poem that he had written
Mm.
about a man who was sitting at the window, like listening for the voice of God, but he was a skeptical man. And so he wasn't going to allow himself to be um, tricked, like by kind of like hallucination essentially.
Right.
And so, but he was still open to it, and he spent his whole life sitting, waiting. And that's what I think, like in terms of like religion,
Yeah.
that's what we're doing. Is kind of we're just listening, right? But I
Yeah.
think in terms of like science and truth, it's kind of a similar thing, right? Because like as an example, like, and I'm gonna like shame my or like out myself on this. I was huge, like I had a huge interest and fascination with Graham Hancock and the book "The Fingerprints of the Gods,"
Okay.
which
I
if you
don't
don't
know
know
if
this
you
book,
that one.
it was an argument that there was
Oh,
like an ancient civilization that was
yes.
essentially Atlantis,
Yes.
and his argument was that there was something called earth crust displacement, where basically like the outer crust of the earth is like kind of like a loose orange peel, and because it's spinning, eventually every once in a while it shifts on across the mantle, and that creates like this big cataclysm. And so his I thought was that like the last cataclysm caused the continent that Atlantis was on to shift down to the Antarctic, and Antarctica was basically where Atlantis was existing, which is why we don't any relics of it, right?
Right.
I was fascinated by him. There's a lot of stuff in his book that is very scientific. Like he
Yeah.
does talk about like he talks about precession, which is kind of like the Earth is kind of like tilted on its axis and slowly kind of turns, over time. And eventually the North Pole will point at a different star, which coincidentally is the star Vega from the movie Contact.
Oh.
Will eventually one day become the new North Star due to precession.
Oh, wait,
Yeah.
so he pulled that from that movie?
No, he didn't pull it from that movie. It's just coincidental.
Oh,
Coincidentally, they're the same. It's the same thing. I
okay.
just thought it was funny. But because of that, like over time, like the stars will be in different positions and things as well. And so this is where like the age of Aquarius comes into play, because eventually what will happen
Okay.
is like at a certain, I don't remember if it's like the equinox or one of the summer solstice or winter solstice, basically the sun will rise and like in a particular house. And so right now we're like in the age of Pisces, I want to say. So like, by the way, everything in your newspaper is wrong about your astrological sign.
Oh,
So
because like
like, yeah,
everything is
mine says
shifted.
mine says I'm an Aries. I'm actually a Pisces based on
Yeah.
the current age we're in. But eventually it'll move into the age of Aquarius, and so like we'll shift again in all of our but anyway, that's more. But there's stuff like that that's in his books. He goes to all these different cultures. Yes, those buildings exist: Machu Picchu, the Olmecs, the Mayans, the oh gosh, what's the one in India that I can't think of? Anyway, but those places all exist, and he brings them all up, and he tells you a lot about the history of all of these places, but then also brings in a lot of pseudoscience. And so sussing that out
Yeah.
is really a challenge. But I
So
spent years trying to find like that alternative view and couldn't find it anywhere
yeah.
until I came across a book called Ancient Mysteries. And I'm trying to remember the name
Okay.
of the authors who did it. And then I saw, and they presented like a very rational, logical argument about what some of the things were that he had said that were wrong. And once I kind of saw like, oh, wow, like they poked big holes in big parts of his
Yeah.
theory. And so now it made me really question like other parts of what he had said. And then later I find little things like there was a thing about like cracking the Mayan code, which was on Netflix, where they talked about like a symbol that was initially drawn as an elephant. And then they show the actual picture of the symbol, and it doesn't look anything like an elephant. It was the person drew it wrong. But that's one of the things that Graham Hancock used as an example of like, see, there was like cross-pollination between these cultures, right? But I listened. I had my ears open, and eventually I heard the truth, you know, and and that's kind of how I feel like it's true about, you know, like when it comes to religious truth is kind of, if you have somebody who's telling you with absolute certainty that this is the way things are, like run. You know, in Buddhism, they say like if you encounter the Buddha on the road, kill him. Because the idea is that that's not the Buddha. Like that's some kind of preconception that you have of it. And so be open, have your ears open, listen, and eventually that truth will come to you, and you'll be like, yes, this fits with my worldview. This fits with my idea. And some of it, like kind of what you're saying, it is going to be subjective, you know, because like as an example, like Joseph Campbell talks about a tribe in another country, and I don't remember what country it's in, but one of their traditions is that they're a very warlike group. They actually do engage in cannibalism, and one of the rituals that they engage in, and it's horrifying when you think of it from like a Western cultural perspective, they put a woman in a building, and all of the men in the tribe basically go in and essentially rape her, and then the last guy who goes in, they collapse the house on the two of them. And it's it's to our perspective, that's just that's horrific. That's heinous. But there's some meaning that they attach to that has to do with like the renewal of their culture and that death and rebirth. And we can't adopt that. That is too alien. That is so far outside of our truth that we can't even like fathom it. But it means something to them. And I also like, you know, there was a situation. One of the things I learned when I was in grad school was a culture that we had moved in the, you know, like in the forest of the Amazon to a different location because they were basically developing that area that they were living in out. And the area that we moved them to were basically had a similar like habitat. So like they had the right foods and things that they could get, but they were experiencing symptoms of distress. And so they're trying to treat it from kind of like, you know, like our typical like therapeutic practice, you know, like for anxiety, depression, we're giving them medications and so on and so forth. And we're humming along with that. And that's when people start dying. And we're like, you know, and so finally at some point, somebody comes to the tribe and goes like, what do you think is happening? Which is good therapeutic practice, by the way. You ask the person, what do you think is happening? Right. And they said, this land hasn't been blessed. And so the spirits that are here are angered, and they're attacking us and possessing us. And so what we need right now is a shaman who can come in here and bless the land. So they brought the shaman in, blessed the land.
Everything was fixed.
Everybody went back to, everything was fine. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that we also have to recognize. Our truth, like psychological truth in that situation, isn't their truth.
Right.
And so there is some subjectivity to it, you know, but again, being open to it, understanding that.
Yeah, for sure. And like because like when I hear that, like I hear the like incredible nature of the human nervous system to be extremely like strongly influenced by like stories and things like that. How like these stories are so impactful to the way our bodies, you know, process trauma, even to the fact of when I went to Haiti for missions trips. I'm Haitian, and my dad is president of a charitable organization over there, and we travel there. He goes there like almost yearly, and I went with him one year, and there was a woman who was having a demonic possession, and there was an exorcism performed. But our human nervous system is so advanced and complex that it really can create like this entire like presentation of symptoms that is like pretty jarring to see and witness. And the person's nervous system like knows what fixes it, So like when it receives that, it is calmed and it's like
Yeah.
satisfied.
Yeah.
And also like that type of a like ecstatic release is not just for Christians or demon possession. There are like other cultures who also kind of engage in like
Yeah.
some type of like ecstatic release, and
Yeah.
those are helpful.
Yeah.
But me going to them and saying like, "Oh, this is your nervous," like they're gonna be like, "That
Right.
doesn't help me." You know what I
Right.
mean? Just because like, but that is what's helpful to them. And then
Right.
also I hear how like Hollis is saying like, I'm not gonna
Yes.
spend time, making someone else care about climate change.
Right. And even kind of from, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that's kind of the thing. It's like if a person is interested in the truth, like they'll hear it and they'll find
Yeah.
it. And then
Yeah.
obviously like it's also complicated because it's like, okay, then whose truth is right? Like, am I sitting here
Right.
thinking that like my truth is the truth? And it's like, no, that's literally that would be me going against exactly what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And I think, kind of going to Hollis's point, which is that like, you're not going to convince somebody who really is wholly invested
right.
in that creation, that creationist view.
Yeah. Who didn't
That
kill the Buddha, but just was like, thank you, Buddha, for
right.
stopping
Yeah,
on the
they've
road.
embraced that.
Yeah.
And you coming from a scientific perspective isn't going to shape them because they've rejected that completely. And there's a big reason for it. And it's actually something that comes from like it's a concept, a psychological concept called the backfire effect, right? If you go to somebody, like we'll talk, like we're talking about global warming, right? And you basically present like a very logical, very rational, very, like objective argument of like, this is why global warming is a fact, and this is what we know, right? What will likely happen from that argument is that person will come away from that conversation having doubled down even harder on their original erroneous belief.
Right.
And the reason is because their entire identity is tied to being part of this community. And it's kind of along, and there's even like maybe a potential like survival issue that comes from that, right? Which is that like if you're sitting around here and you've got like nuts and berries everywhere and somebody else comes and like says there's more over there, right? You're going to be like, I'm not going to go over there because that's miles and miles away, right? To go and, on the hope that they're there, right? When I'm doing just fine over here. And by the way, if there are so many over there, why aren't you over there?
Right.
So there's a survival element to it because when you lose your people, you're alone. And in the wild, in the wilderness, that's death. That's a death sentence.
Yeah.
So there's a reason we tie ourselves, to these beliefs is because it keeps us part of that community. And so what you want to do is you want to focus on the people who are kind of on the fence. The people are like, I'm not really sure where I'm going on this. I don't know if I'm going, if I'm going more creationist or science. So you focus on them. And you're also wanting to kind of focus on the people who are part of that community, who are on the fence, because they are more likely to be able to reach that person, with an argument that fits within their worldview of God and, and religion. And yeah, exactly. You're going to waste your time if you try to do that. Like to say that like, yeah, no, there aren't spirits here. They're going to, they're not going to believe that. They're going to die. So you have to meet people where they are. That's also a big thing that comes up in therapy. They say it as they're at, and the English major in me struggles with that because of it ends with a preposition. But anyway, but meet people where they are.
Right.
And then try to move from there. And I think one of the things too that like I talk to my clients about, is that feelings are always valid.
Yeah.
And so like, even if, if somebody is living their lives, with the belief that God will punish them and they leave their house, right? That's insane, and, and that decision never to leave the house because you're afraid that God will punish you. That's insane. But that fear is real.
Yeah.
And being able to talk to them from that point of view and saying like, I can imagine that's scary to live a life where you're constantly, in fear of leaving the house, and it limits what you can do. And that's just, and that's a struggle, right?
Yeah.
Being able to come at them from there, now you can have a conversation because there isn't that fight. They're not having to convince you anymore that yes, God is really going to smite me if I leave the house, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think meeting people where they're at is exactly where we need to be.
Yeah.
And I think about this statement is the thing that I'm trying to get across is that both of these things are true. The tribe's experience was real. Their
Yes.
experience was very, very real, and
Yeah.
that's what matters.
Yeah.
Um, it at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if there are spirits or not because it's happening.
Right.
If anyone is aware, oh, damn it, I forget his name. He's like this British magician who he does a lot of like he pretty much like will trick people into thinking that he's a psychic when he's not, and that's kind of
Mm.
like his whole shtick is pretty
Mm.
much showing people that all of the techniques that we've seen in spiritual circles, like speaking in tongues and people passing out from the spirit, he's able to do all of that like
Right.
all like off of the top of his head and like make people do crazy stuff, and then people will literally like believe in God because of him, and he'll say, like this is the opposite of that, and they will walk away believing in God anyway, even though he
Right.
says like this is
Mm.
magic, like this is a trick.
Right.
But like the yeah, the what's happening is real, right?
Yeah.
People are
Mhm.
actually catching the spirit and passing out,
Yeah.
right? It's a
Yeah.
real thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Like
Right.
the experience is what's important because
Right.
the spiritual world exists in our minds, right? It
Right.
exists up here. Like
Yeah.
I can have Jesus appear to me, right? In a
Right.
real magnificent vision, and that's real to
Right.
me, right? But like the thing that I would like I guess disagree on is kind of like the external interpretation saying that like that means that there is a real Jesus that actually
Mhm.
exists and like can hurt you or can send you to
Right.
hell or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I think too, like coming from Buddhism, there are things that that like that I know, where I'm like, like the Dalai Lama, the way he was picked, was basically they put him to a test and he had to like, like did he find the boot, like I can't remember what they call them, but basically they're kind of like they kind of look like rosary beads.
oh yeah,
And would he pick the ones that belonged to the previous Dalai Lama?
oh yeah,
And so he, so they put him to that test and he fails it. And so, that should have been it, right? But they're like, no, see, he owned this other set that he picked at another time, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah,
Like, you're kind of like, yeah, but
right,
nevertheless,
yeah,
like I'm able to orient myself to this belief practice, of Buddhism. Like,
yeah,
even though I don't think the Dalai Lama is, like the literal reincarnation of the
right,
previous Dalai Lama, there's something about the way that this all works that's really kind of powerful and significant, which
mhm,
is that somebody who is just a regular person within society is chosen as the leader of their people. And he didn't come from like nobility. He was, he was a poor person.
yeah,
And so that's an interesting way of choosing leadership, and then and then kind of devoting structuring the lives of the people in that region around that. The
yeah,
way they converted the people in the region of Tibet to Buddhism was not by converting the people. They went around and converted their gods. They would send a priest to the other gods, like the mountain god in the region, and say like, and they would do like some ritual, and by the end of the ritual they would basically say like, yeah, the mountain god's now Buddhist.
wow,
And it's,
huh.
yeah, I'm skeptical that there really is a mountain god. I'm skeptical that they were really converted to Buddhism, right? But
Right,
the story is lovely to
yeah,
me. And I
yeah,
love that they were able to orient their lives to that and have respect for that other, for those other views in a way, meeting them where they are. And
yeah.
yeah. So.
Yeah, and I do want to address this last comment really quick that if
Mm,
everyone's experience is valid, then calling them insane is a value judgment and hypocritical.
yeah.
What I think about that is that like I definitely, as a therapist,
Hmm.
um, like will have that thing happen. Like your belief is definitely true, But like you thinking that if you take a step outside that you'll implode, or that if you eat that snack that you'll die, is kind of ridiculous, friend.
Right.
Like,
And
and
yeah, and
also
that's,
like it can go like to an insane degree. Like if someone was like, I actually have a unicorn in my closet that we've been best friends for 6 years and he's real and he
right,
gives me kisses every night. I'm gonna
right,
say that's insane. Like I
right,
love you very much and you're
right,
valid for having that experience, but it's insane.
right. But I think, again, it
Yeah,
wasn't that everybody's experience is valid. Their feelings are valid.
right.
How they feel about the situation. They're, like that tribe that we were talking about earlier. They were so anxious and experiencing such high symptoms, they were dying.
They were dying. That
Yes.
is incredible. Incredible.
Yeah. And so
So
that's
amazing.
where we start. The
Yeah.
feelings are valid. And
And
then try,
interpretations.
right.
That's the other way that because like,
Yeah.
like for example, when I'm a little kid and my dad yells at me, my interpretation is dad hates me, right? But as an
Yeah.
adult, I'm able to learn, oh, dad was mad at work
Yeah.
and he took
Yeah,
it out.
that thought is the thing that we're
Right.
reframing. That thought is the thing that
Yeah.
we're challenging. And even like when it comes to like certain religious viewpoints, like, like the Bible really does literally state that the earth is flat and that we're basically under a big metal dome,
Right.
called I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, yeah, we're basically in a big metal dome and that's the sky, right? And there's a giant ocean that's outside of that, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not true. Like
Right.
everything in our reality says that that's not true, but there are aspects of like, kind of, again, there's an emotional adherence to that. There's a community adherence to that people kind of get involved in, and it's almost like cult like. And really,
Oh,
when we deal with people who are struggling to get out of a cult, you don't deal with the rationalization of like this isn't real or this what they're teaching you is bad. What you do is you try to connect them to the emotions that they have and the experience that they have with their family. Like,
yeah.
don't you love your mom? Don't you love your dad? Don't you want to have that connection with them again? Your brother misses you,
Yeah.
and he wants to reconnect. Your sister sent you this thing.
Yeah.
That's what you're trying to reconnect them with, because right at that moment, what has happened is they've disconnected from that emotional experience and they're all cognitive. That's the problem. That's what happens when we get into like, like kind of these almost like creationists and like flat earth theory and things like that. It's all cognitive. We're literally rationalizing everything away.
Yeah.
We have disconnected from the emotional experience, and that's
Yeah.
why we need to get them reconnected with that. And and bring them back down into their bodies, bring them allowing them to feel that, because at that point what has happened is that doesn't feel comfortable anymore. Connecting with my emotions isn't comfortable anymore.
Yeah.
And that's why, and so, yeah, I have to rationalize everything away, because if I get into if I get into my body and start to feel that, that's when I'm starting to feel the confusion and the doubt and the everything that you've kind of gone through.
Yeah.
And then later, the feeling of betrayal and anger and resentment, because you realize that those people have been deluding you this entire time.
Yeah, and maybe that's why I feel so passionate about this stuff, is because it's not just me. I work and interact with people every week who like have been very, very severely damaged by these ideas and by holding these ideas and like obviously like proselytizing like a Christian does about rationalism and skepticism is like not the way to go. He's kind of just like sitting here and be like, I'm going to talk about this stuff, and if you want to listen, fine. But it's super important to like have this other perspective shown that we were able to talk about today. Like we can have our cake and eat it too. Like we can have a lot of like honestly like pleasure and enjoyment and awe and excitement and like magic and wonder like within the spiritual realm and within that mystical experience or whatever. But then also like have those experiences be grounded in reality, so that we can, for example, if someone goes on a drug trip and then comes back and was like, yeah, that golden lion that I really talked to was real. Like, I'm going to be like, all right, friend, like, let's talk,
bro.
let's debrief, because that's a real thing. People actually come back from drug trips with some psychosis because of those things. We need to help people come down, like you said, come back into their bodies. And the fact that so many of the clients I work with have almost no idea how to connect to their bodies and their internal emotions is concerning. And these ideas that are being taught and spread, the more common popular ideas, are sustaining this reality. And I think this is an important conversation to hopefully help some people be curious.
Yeah. And it's funny because you mentioned too about like helping people get into their bodies. Like the technique that I use primarily it's actually an extension of EMDR.
Okay.
It's called the comprehensive resource model.
Okay. I think I've,
And
yeah.
yeah, and
Let
one of
me,
the things that's
yeah.
really interesting when you using it is that a lot of the language around it sounds kind of mystical and woo-woo. And like when I first came into it, I was like, boy, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because basically what it is you start with breathing techniques. And the breathing techniques have names
Okay.
like ocean breathing, earth breathing, heart breathing, fire breathing, right? This sounds very kind of new age spiritual,
Yeah.
right? And so like the ocean breathing, what you're doing is you're imagining your breath like the ocean waves. And so when you
Mm-hmm.
breathe in, the ocean waves are receding. When you breathe out, the ocean waves are crashing on the shore. And you do that for a few minutes. And that basically what that's doing is it's getting you to connect with your body, connect with your, breath, starting to, because one of the things we recognize is that when you take deep breaths, when you relax the muscles in your body, it basically tells your brain there's no threat right now. And so it shuts down the cortisol, it shuts down the adrenaline. And
Yeah.
that's why you get the kind of like that, like, feeling like when you've meditated, is because suddenly you've relaxed you've relaxed your mind with your body.
Right.
So that's the first one. And then earth breathing is grounding yourself by basically imagining that you're breathing in energy from the earth into your pelvis, and then through a point that's connected, a point in your body that's connected with the ground or surface beneath you, and then breathing it back down into the earth.
Wow.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you're not actually breathing the earth energy in, like you're imagining that, but doing that, you can feel it. You can literally
Really?
feel it
Yes.
coming into your body,
Yeah.
and it grounds you, and you can feel
Yeah.
like, and particularly because it's in your pelvis, you can feel like, oh wow, I can really feel myself sitting now. I can
Yeah.
feel my feet, or my, or that point in my body that I feel, that's connected with the ground or surface beneath me. And then the heart breathing, because a lot of times what happens with people is we're actually realizing that self-esteem is not what we're going for. Increasing somebody's self-esteem actually increases narcissistic traits. There's
Hmm.
research that's shown that, right? What we want to increase is self-compassion, so that when you
Okay.
fail, it's like, yeah, that's okay. That hurts, right? But
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get back up and we're going to try again, right?
Yeah.
That's what we want to see, as opposed to like, like having
Huh.
self-esteem can often have it be like, oh, well, they were unfair, or I wasn't treated well, or
Hmm.
my teacher doesn't like me, et cetera, right? It becomes like that sort of narcissistic trait that like,
Yeah.
that none of this is my fault. It's always somebody else, right?
Hmm.
Um, the heart breathing is basically imagining that you're breathing in loving, compassionate energy from the sky above and the earth below into your chest where your heart is,
Mm-hmm.
and then breathing that out. And I like to say to breathe that out to the people you love in your life.
Yeah.
Because one of the things, and kind of this, if you ever do like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, it's often based on Buddhist meditation
Yeah.
practices.
Yeah. For
And
sure.
one of the things they do is the loving kindness meditation.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you can't really show love and compassion for other people without essentially like burning out, unless you can show love for yourself first.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where the heart breathing comes in, is that it's
Mm-hmm.
that showing love for yourself. And the fire breathing, we recommend that you only do like with a therapist who's trained. But it's basically a way of like, when you're still feeling that distress from whatever trauma that you had, you're breathing it out and imagining it as like fire.
Okay.
And, so, that you're, and just kind of keeping your mouth open and your throat relaxed. So it's all
Yeah.
coming out and you're not like tensed up. It's not like, right. It's like,
Right.
and just very forceful. Um, and that's getting the body relaxed.
Yeah.
And then there's a visual meditation we do that's called the sacred space. Again, has this kind of like mystical,
Yeah.
religious tone to it. But it's basically imagining a space that's outdoors, that's natural, that feels sacred to you,
Hmm.
and that you can go there and feel centered and grounded.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I think of it sort of like the Mind Palace in Sherlock Holmes in a way,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a place where you can kind of like, if you're really struggling, you can go there and come out of like kind of your current environment, because that's the other thing we know, is that environment often plays a role in
Hmm.
how you're feeling,
Right.
which is why more recent addiction recovery, moving away from 12 steps, focuses on what's going on in your environment that's causing you to feel like you want to drink or use, right? But it's taking you out of your environment. It's putting you in a place that feels safe,
Yeah.
even though it's imaginary. And then the part that's like the part that is just the most amazing for me is the power animal. And it's different from like a spirit animal, but it's an inner part it's that shows love, wisdom, and compassion for you, and that you can connect with, and and even like talk with it about the problems that you're having. And it's like talking to somebody else. And like,
Yeah.
I've done it, and there have been times where like I do it and I'm like, wow, why didn't I think of it? Wait, no, I did think of that, like technically, like
Yes. Yeah.
and so yeah, it feels very woo-woo, but there's a lot of it that's
Yeah.
just really powerful, and it's pulling on that language of religion, because what's happening with the language of religion, myth, metaphor, and symbol, is it's connecting with those older parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus, the emotions, those parts that like we're not consciously aware of,
Right. Yeah.
and giving us like a cognitive map and understanding of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like
Exactly.
when you, yeah. And so that's why we don't understand them a lot of times. The stories don't make sense.
Yeah.
But yet there's still something about them that feels profound,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Um, and so, yeah, like if you're looking at, like even, if you look at like, there's a story by Kafka, and I always like to tell it because it has a mythical quality to it.
Okay.
Which is that, there's a guy who goes to the gates of the law, and he wants to be let in. And there's a guardian there that says, well, you can come in, but you have to wait until somebody comes and gets you, right? And so he said, he gives the guard gives him a stool to sit on and kind of wait. And every once in a while he asks, like, is it my turn yet? And he's like, no. And he says, what, and every once in a while he'll ask, well, what would happen if I just tried to go in? And he says, well, you can try that. But there are other guardians at other gates further in, and they're even more formidable than I am. In fact, the third one I can't even look at. He's so horrifying and terrifying, right? And so he continues to sit. And every once in a while, he'll engage the guard in conversation, and they'll kind of chat for a while. And the guard will then say at the end of each conversation, you still can't go in. And the guy gives him all of the possessions that he has, his jewelry, his money, and everything, in the hopes that he can get, gain entrance, bribe him. And he says, and the guard will say, I'm only taking these things so that you don't feel like there's anything that you haven't given up, right?
Mm.
That you haven't done everything that you could to get in, right? And eventually, at the very end of his life, right, this guy is like enfeebled at this point. He can't move. He can't, like he can barely see, he can barely hear. But he says to him, he says, I'm basically at the end of my life, but I have one last question. And the guard says to him, and you and your questions. He says, go ahead, right? And he says, in all the time that I've been sitting here, nobody else has ever come here to the gates. And he says, and why is that? And the guard, realizing that he's losing his hearing, leads down and says in his ear fairly loudly, that's because this gate was built for you. And I'm going to shut it now. And I don't know what that story means exactly, but I get the chills like every time I hear it. And I think, and it's because it's touching something more like primitive, like, like kind of that part of the brain that we don't really have connection with. And so we use this part up here to make sense of it, that emotional experience that we have there, of maybe the unfairness of that situation, the fact that the law really isn't accessible to everybody, that he is maybe that we are the reasons that we don't have that access, that we look at that guard as the only obstruction in our lives. And, so we can rationalize it away, but there really isn't one answer to that. And that's kind of what religion is supposed to do. That's what myth is supposed to do. That's what parables are supposed to do, is give you sort of that mystery and to start thinking about, what does that mean? Why does that have that emotional reaction for me? What's going on deeper in my body? And so that's why I think like the comprehensive resource model uses those kind of religious kind of elements to them to help you connect with those older parts of the brain.
Perfect. Yeah. I love that. And I am like such a firm believer in any type of like body-based practice, like EMDR. I've talked about focusing, which is another similar type of thing, and any other type of like thing where you're like letting your body lead and connecting with your body as kind of a means of processing trauma and stuff like that. That's very, very helpful. Even in my own therapy, like, it's been effective for me being in therapy. And as a practitioner, help like working
Sure. And yeah, with CRM, there's more to it too. Like you're actually doing younger part work and like,
Right.
and stuff like that. But it's, but again, a lot of it is that kind of visual, that, that religious and spiritual symbology that kind of comes with it to help get there.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
but yeah. So, but I think too, it's not just, like CRM is, like I said, my favorite modality, particularly for trauma, but it's not the only thing I've ever used, and so like a lot of times I have clients who they'll be into tarot, and
Yeah.
like I personally don't ascribe to the idea that tarot is like you're connecting with spirits and they're giving you messages, right?
Right.
I kind of look at it from more of like a narrative therapeutic perspective, which is that it's basically a narrative scaffold that you can kind of put meaning on.
Okay. Yes.
And so, yeah. And so what I do is I work with my clients and say, like, what's the problem that we're trying to work on? And, then we use the cards and kind of see like, like it says, this is the real problem. This is like there's a particular way I use it. It's not the cross. I can't remember. Maggie Stiefvater put together a book on, like how to use, or like and she mentioned this tarot reading style.
Okay.
But anyway, but basically it's like what the problem, what you think the problem is, what the real problem is, like how, like what you think the solution is, what the real solution is, and
Okay.
like some other things. And, it's a way of like, basically, if you know something about tarot, you can read into the cards.
Right.
And now you have a solution that you've created for yourself.
Right.
And all you have to do is implement it.
Mhm.
Right. Or you can kind of, if you have that spiritual belief in it, is to say that, these external spirits have communicated this message to me, guardian angels or God or whatever you want to think of it as, or, the triple goddess. They've communicated to me through the tarot cards this message, and now I'm going to enact it. They're trying to guide me. And so, it can be a really powerful tool and therapeutic tool to be able to help somebody take something that's part of their life already
Yeah.
and use it in a therapeutic way.
Right.
And I think too, like even when I have clients, particularly when I have clients who are struggling with a breakup,
Mm.
I like to use a story. It's from Buddhism
Yeah.
of a woman whose son had died.
Mhm.
And so she's wandering the countryside, kind of looking for somebody, a wise person who
Mm.
can bring her son back to life. And eventually she stumbles upon a man who says, the Buddha's in town. Maybe you should go and speak with him. So she does. And the Buddha basically says, oh, yeah, I can bring your son back to life. But what I need from you is I need you to bring me a mustard seed from a family that's never experienced death. And she's like ecstatic. She's
Yeah.
thrilled because her village trades in mustard seeds. And so they have tons of them. So she goes back to her to her town, like absolutely elated. And goes to her neighbors and says, do you have mustard seeds? And they're like, of course, yeah, of course,
Yeah.
And she says, has anyone in your family ever experienced death? And they're like, well, yeah, my grandfather died, or my father died, or my sister died, or my mom died, and so she goes, to every house in the village. And then it's finally late at night. She goes to the last house. And again, they have to turn her away because, of course, yeah, they've experienced death. And that's when she realizes what the Buddha was trying to tell her, which is that death comes to us all.
Yeah.
And so she goes back and she builds the funeral pyre. And as she's mourning the loss of her son, and watching his body burn, she says, in all the universe, there's only one truth, and it's this, that all things are impermanent.
Yeah.
And I like to tell that to my clients who are struggling with
Mm.
a breakup, because unlike death, there's which has a finality to it. And we're not going to be like the woman kind of scouring the countryside for the wise person who will bring them back to life. The person we broke up with is still alive. And there is the hope that relationship will rekindle and come back to life.
Mhm.
And as long as we hold on to that, we can't go on. We can't move on. We're
Yeah.
stuck. We're
Right.
holding on to it.
Yeah.
And so the only way forward is to grieve
Yeah.
and to have that ritual, like the funeral pyre, whatever that happens to be for you.
Yeah.
to just say, I'm letting go now. If that's burning the letters that, that you got that were love letters, or just listening to your favorite song that the two of you had and crying, or, listening to your breakup song. A friend of mine called my wife at one point, and she says, because she was going through a breakup, she says, would you do something for me? And she says, yeah, sure. She says, could you sing Breaking Up Is Hard to Do with me right now?
Um,
And so we have to go through that. We
yeah.
have to have that ritual in our lives to let
Yeah.
go, or else we are being held back. We are stuck in that old relationship, and we can't be open to something new.
Right.
And so, yeah, so that's how I've used, a lot of like that spirituality and stuff in my practice. And there's more, but yeah.
And I
What
think
about
that's,
you? Like, you mentioned that you try to
yeah.
use it in your stuff, and I'm curious, like, how have you used spiritual practices?
Yeah, I think, so for me, the most profound spiritual practices have involved like me building a relationship like with my own body.
Mm,
And yeah, in a lot of ways, and also like building a relationship with aspects of myself that I'm disconnected to.
mm,
Um, so just as you were saying, like you like use the tarot, or you have a conversation with your power animal, and you're like, I could have come up with that. Like, but just so what I'm saying is like when we are able to get into these states, we're able to unleashes like incredible wisdom. If you've ever seen
mhm,
people like do channeling or something like that, profound
mm.
wisdom can come out of their mouths.
Oh, yeah.
Um, when I would used to do a lot of like preachy stuff, I
Yeah.
know the feeling of like
Mhm.
just opening your mouth and having this like wisdom just like flow out, and it feels like it's not even you, like it's
Yeah.
just like coming out of you or whatever. And after I kind of moved away from a religion, the answer that I was left with was that was all me and my brain and my mind and the infinite wisdom of like
Yeah.
whatever that is just like that exists within all of us. So like I want
Mm,
to get to know that aspect of me a little bit more. So I guess in the way
yeah.
that I work with other people is by helping them connect with themselves, and a lot of the times the stories that they've told themselves about their lives,
Yeah.
and teaching them practices that help them connect to their body in a very practical way,
Right.
that teach them how to kind of like develop their imagination, which I think is a
Mm,
very important thing. I think play is a huge part of spirituality. I think there's a really big reason why God in the evangelicals, Christian space talked a lot about having
mhm,
to be like a child in order to kind of
mm,
understand a lot of this stuff.
yeah.
And so kind of teaching a lot of that exploration and play has been super helpful for a lot of my clients and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, it also just like helps you kind of have more imaginative solutions, even when you get stuck in life, like you can kind
Right.
of tap into your imagination. Um, Tons of researchers, and even I know like Albert Einstein used to like go into these meditative states, and they would
Hmm.
come up with these scientific ideas while they were doing these practices.
I knew he did it with dreams, like that he was able to
Yeah.
come up, like he kind of came up with a lot of his ideas about um gravity and light, and
Mhm.
and how that worked from like dreaming about it essentially. And I know like the I don't know if it was Crick or was it Watts? Anyway, the guys that kind of were looking up or were trying to like figure out the structure of DNA, but one of them had a dream about um, a serpent that was eating its
Eating its
tail.
own tail. Yep.
Yeah, and that's like Ouroboros, which is a
Yeah.
mythical, character. But when
Yeah.
he awoke, that's when he recognized the double helix. That's
Yeah.
what, that's how he knew what it was just this dream. Somehow his subconscious was able to bring that and manifest that. But yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, and I think that the dream world is similar to our imaginative world, like in
Mhm.
how like unpredictable and symbolic it is,
Yeah.
and how like I can access my emotions, and like my
Mhm.
subconscious will like show me an orange square, and that'll somehow
Mm.
lead me to like profound realizations about my life. And it's like,
Yeah.
how does that actually happen? I don't understand it. I don't
Yeah.
have to understand it. I'm kind of
Yeah.
I'm choosing to be in awe, of
Yeah.
of this process that lives within me.
Yeah. And like with my clients, when they have dreams and they're trying to figure things out, and it's like a recurring dream, there's two things that I do. One is I basically say to them, like, when you first wake up, what's the first thing that you were thinking about when you woke up? You know, like, oh, I was worrying about my, you know, I realized I was worrying about my brother or whatever. And it's like, oh, okay. And how did the dream symbolism relate to that? And then we realize, you know, it's like every time it's like, oh God, you're right. You're right. Like this was happening in the dream. And now that, you know, and this is what's happening with my brother. And so they're making those connections. And the other thing is too, is again, it's a story. And a lot of times when people have like recurring nightmares or something like that, what I'll do is I'll encourage them to journal about it. And because when we get to the nightmare, it's like we hit the climax of that story. And that's when we wake up, right? So write the rest of the story. Write the satisfying ending. Write how you would want to address this.
Yeah.
You know, you're running from somebody, you know, turn, confront them. What happens next? You know, and you know, and so it is. It's kind of, again, it's bringing your life, you know, centering your life around a story. And again, that's kind of coming from narrative therapy, yeah, and kind of trying to figure out, you know, because yeah, dreams are basically our subconscious trying to process what we, you know, weren't able to process in our daily lives.
Yeah, and I think like sometimes getting into these states and like even like the ocean breathing, I'm sure can even get us into a more relaxed state where we're able to kind of like sneak into that space, that like more dreamish space where our brain is like the stressful parts of it or whatever are like shutting down, and like the more imaginative parts can kind of show themselves a little bit more.
Right. And when I do like addiction recovery, one of the things I use is called Mindfulness-Based Relapse Prevention.
Okay.
And it's basically like it's a manualized technique. You know, there's like 8 sessions. You go through each session just one by one.
Okay.
And what's really wonderful about it is that what it's doing, like as opposed to 12 steps, which is that's a whole nother thing, because that's also very religiously based.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that you'll notice is that like the people who struggle to go through it are often people who don't have a belief in God.
Right.
And, you know, and often members of the LGBT community.
Yeah.
Because it was the religious community that kind of persecuted them. And now you're basically asking them to accept the one thing, again, kind of going back to that earlier conversation we were having, like that one thing you can't believe in. Now you have to suddenly accept that it's real in order to recover from addiction. That's insane. But mindfulness-based relapse prevention, what it does is it basically takes each of those moments where you're struggling and you want to use and saying, what's going on in that moment? Get down, you know, like take a moment, step back, breathe through it, observe what's happening around you, expand your awareness, start to notice like what you're thinking, what you're feeling internally. What are some of the things that you're doing mindlessly that kind of get you there? You know, like you go to, you know, there's a liquor store across the street from your house, or you happen to, you know, you just kind of wandering down the aisle and then like, oh, there's wine coolers on sale, like, you know, like grabbing that without even thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Using the, you know, the techniques of mindfulness from Buddhism to start to be aware of those triggers, to be aware of the thoughts and feelings that came up beforehand, to slow down, and then to think about like, okay, so those are my triggers. Those are the things in the environment that are going to, like, you know, that are going to make me want to drink or use. What am I doing now to when I go into, because those experiences are going to happen again. And so what am I going to do when I get into those situations, so that I can approach them from a more mindful perspective and I don't have to use and make a different choice. And so I found I've had really good luck with that one. You know, and a lot of the people who I've worked with who've struggled with drug use or alcohol use, they may not completely stop using, but they get to a place where they're feeling like, yeah, this is where I want to be. This is how I want it to look. I'm not using now to just numb the pain. I'm using as, you know, for social reasons, or for, you know, just, you know, for whatever purpose, you know, and I feel comfortable with it now.
I love that. And and that also like it gives people the freedom to kind of be autonomous in how they're choosing to recover. And like recovery doesn't always have to look like abstinence. And letting people explore their own limits. And I think that's super helpful. And while you were talking, I was thinking about also like I oftentimes like have clients who will talk to me about their spiritual views, or like if they're doing
Mm.
witchcraft, like the rituals that they're doing, how that's
Yeah.
impacting their mental health. And like I find that like supporting people in their beliefs that they have like
Mhm.
has been a useful way to go. Like I'm not the kind of person, unless they're in a place where they're like having a lot of questions about things, and they're like
Mhm.
they would like to know like a more evidence-based perspective,
Yeah.
I can offer
Yeah.
that. But then otherwise, like I like talk to them about how to even like deepen their relationship with their deities, because like that's where
Mm.
they're at right now. Like
Yeah.
that's what's important to them. Like I'm not
Mm.
interested really in yeah, I'm not really interested in people not believing in God. I'm maybe more interested in having people like have a more grounded perspective, hopefully, on some of those things. And I do want to quickly address this
Yes. Yeah, I was gonna say I
question,
wanna kinda get to that too at some point.
um,
Yeah.
because for me, like I like as a person who I would definitely consider myself like, like fuck the man, and like nobody tells me what to do and things like that.
Mhm.
So me coming to this place where I'm kind of like trusting the scientific body of evidence, um, is kind of an odd thing, I think, and can be.
Mhm.
I think that might be what Hollis is trying to get to.
Mhm.
But like if that is being the acceptable predetermined standards by the kind of scientific body,
Mm.
um, and I think that helping a person like after um, so like not helping someone like integrate the truth is
Mm.
like is more dangerous than saying you can just go ahead and believe in a
Right.
lion, like, or the
Yeah.
golden lion or whatever.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, like if for example it was some type of demon that says I'm going to come and chase you for the rest of your life,
Mhm.
if the person leaves believing that that's real, they will be terrorized for a very
Yeah.
long time. So helping them like talk about what does that demon represent? What did
Yeah.
that golden lion represent for you?
Mhm. Yeah.
That is something that's more
How can you incorporate that demon into your life knowing they're gonna
right.
chase you for the rest of your life?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Rather than kind of like thinking that there's an actual demonic entity that's chasing
Yeah.
you.
Right.
This is something, in my opinion, right? Could be wrong. And if a person is interested in having these conversations, I'm not forcing anybody to
Mhm.
have these conversations either.
Yeah.
But if they're interested, like
Yeah.
understanding that like having a more grounded perspective can help you manage these things
Mhm.
more effectively. For
Yeah.
example, and this is why this is a problem, is because you have people who are like schizophrenic and are having hallucinations, who
Mhm.
spiritual people are saying you just have a thin the veil is just thinner for you, and you've been chosen by the
Mhm.
deities or whatever to have
Yeah.
like cool. If a person wants to have that perspective, awesome.
Yeah.
But for a person who needs medication and doesn't want that
Right.
to be a part of their life, like
Yeah.
they deserve to get treatment and to
Yeah.
be
And
like
if
yeah,
it doesn't have a spiritual aspect to it, can still, like they're not chosen for that. I've had clients where it's
yeah,
like they thought people were yelling at them,
mm,
like through like through the radio or through or through the fence in their backyard or something like that. And it was like there was no spiritual element to it. It was just terrifying.
yeah,
And they're not chosen for that. That's
yeah,
horrifying. That's heartbreaking. And
yeah,
helping them try to figure out a way to address that and the fear that's coming with that, the anger, the concern that those things are going to somehow hurt them or their families. Like
yeah,
trying to help them figure out a way to navigate that while at the same time trying to get them towards accepting medication.
right,
And that's challenging because
yeah,
the moment you suggest that, now all of a sudden you're one of them.
yeah. I watched this.
And
I watched it was an interview about this documentary where a guy he did a lot of research with an exorcist, I believe in somewhere in South America,
mm,
and like for example, he would have women or people who need an exorcism every couple years or every couple months, or like would have to kind of keep coming back to him for the
mhm,
exorcisms and stuff like that. and they were effective. Like they would, because you were doing this ecstatic thing, you have a ton of endorphins that are released, you will feel better for a couple of months. When that wears away and the trauma comes back and you're not actually processing the trauma, then they'll need the exorcism over and over and over again. So in this situation, like that person, like for her to get actual trauma therapy would be more effective and let her have a better quality of life if she's interested. If she wants to do exorcism for the rest of her life, she has the right to do so. But there are other options. And talking about those options.
And I want to address kind of this piece that Hollis mentioned about the conforming and non-conforming mindsets, because, you know, like you and I are both LGBT, and you know, for me, I didn't come out until last year. And part of it was because, you know, a lot of it was, and it was I used to work at a women's clothing store, and one of the things that I just hated about men's clothing is it's like shirt and jeans or pants, you know, like, you know, and those are your options, right? And that can be nice in some ways because it's just kind of like, I don't have to think about it. I just throw on a shirt and pants, you know, and it's, you know, if it's for work, it's a collared shirt. If it's not, it's a t-shirt, right? You know, but it was limiting, and it frustrated me because I would look at women and they have so many other options. You know, they have bows and, you know, and hair clips and, you know, and cardigans and, you know, and different kinds of shoes and all these, you know, and tights, and it just was a wonderful way to express yourself. And so like women every day can kind of decide, like, I'm going to express myself this way. Whereas men, a lot of times when it comes to their clothes, it's that I'm expressing strength or I'm expressing anger. And I wanted something else, and I didn't know how to express that. And so when I finally came out as non-binary, I was finally allowing myself to do some of those things that I wasn't allowing myself to do before. I'm wearing things that that express frailty, you know, seduction, that, you know, and kind of even like one of the things I love about women, and a lot of times even we're talking about like religion, goddesses often are dual. You know, they represent two things, life and death, you know, like, you know, or love and death is often paired. And, you know, or the, like, kind of like the Madonna whore, you know, it's this duality there that women can have of wanting to show, like, a lot of times being able to show, that they're interested sexually, but also showing demureness, you know? I wanted that. And once I was able to start dressing the way I wanted to and doing the makeup the way I wanted to and so on and so forth, like, I could do that finally. And it was so wonderful. It was such a wonderful feeling. And like, and April of last year, right before my birthday, was the first time I felt self-love.
Wow.
Because I was finally able to express those things. And not only that, but kind of, you know, talking about like the loving kindness, I could feel love from other people finally. Whereas before it felt like I was standing at a window, you know, seeing the fire burning in the fireplace, but not being able to access it. Like people would tell me they loved me or told me that I did a good job or whatever, and I couldn't feel it. And all of a sudden I could feel it. And somebody somebody told me recently that it, you know, kind of from a spiritual perspective, is that that she thought it was really wonderful that I was able to finally open myself up to that, and to kind of let go of the conformity of what it means to be male and female, and to embrace both, because that's what God is. And I was like, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way, but wow. And so it took on like a spiritual element to it, just coming out as non-binary. And and I'm not conforming to those standards that other people have for me anymore. And I think too, you know, kind of going from like the idea of like the drug trip lion, you know, is not real. Like one of the other things that kind of came out of that experience was that I kind of had like a sort of like I guess like you would call it like a religious moment, a religious experience, where I kind of could feel that like we're not just reincarnated, we're interincarnated. So there's parts of ourselves and other people. And so it's like, you know, light shining through a prism, we split out into kind of these different rainbow of colors,
Okay.
and that all of that is coming from this, this ultra divine presence, right? I know that's wacky, and like there's no way I could prove that that's the case, but it feels real, and it feels right, and it feels true to me. And that's kind of where I kind of came down with it, was that like now all of a sudden, like the drug trip lion, like there's that part of me that's like, yeah, that's not real, but there's a part of me that's like, yeah, okay, let's go from there, let's explore that.
Exactly.
And because it had a reality to it, a validity to that person.
Yes, it's both, and that's it. Like this is the non-binary spirituality that I'm talking about. Like it's this ability to say, like, to do both of those things, to like to have this lion in its appropriate place, where it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just in its appropriate place, but when it's in that place, you can explore it and feel and really just like let go of any of that skepticism and just dive into the world of this lion.
And embrace it at the same time. Like you embrace it and let go of it at the same time.
That's all I'm trying to say. Like all of, like, we can have everything we want, at least in terms of like this conversation. We can have the mystical stuff and the trips and the talking to aliens and talking to deities and like doing ritual. We can do all of this stuff and be like fully grounded in reality. Like we can literally do it all.
Yeah. And it kind of along the same lines, like one of the things that I love, Joseph Campbell, he had some problems with women, which I'm just going to acknowledge and address that. Like, he said that like women can't have hero's journeys. Bullshit. Like you go back and you read Vasilisa, the story about she goes to Baba Yaga. Like basically, it's kind of a Cinderella story. Her dad dies. She's left with her wicked stepmother and stepsisters, right? And they want her dead, like so that they can inherit the house, right? So basically, what they do is they send her on a journey to go and see Baba Yaga, who's this like kind of witch woman in the forest, to ask her for fire because they can't light a fire, is what they tell her. They're lying to her, right? But she goes to the forest and she encounters Baba Yaga, and she has a doll from her mom that kind of like helps her with these various tasks that Baba Yaga gives her that are just like absolutely impossible. And at the finally at the end of it, like Baba Yaga is like, fine, here's your freaking fire, get out of here, right? And it's this like skull on a spine as the hand, as the handle of the torch, right? That's like with fire coming out of the eyes, right? And that's what she sends her home with, right? And when she gets home, like the lie that they told her is now true. They can't light a fire. And so so she comes home with this thing, right? And they're like, give me that, right? And like selfishly, and this thing basically burns them away, right? And like destroys her, her wicked stepmother and stepsister. But it's the hero's journey, right? The call to adventure, the journey, the road of trials, the reconciliation with the mother in this case instead of the father, and then the return home from the underworld, with the treasure that you've taken and brought it back. That's the hero's journey. Bullshit that women can't have. But anyway, he had this idea that like what happened with the tree, the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, was that what it was it gave us that dichotomy that these are two separate things, and and in doing that, it created the suffering. It created that sense of disconnection from God, and it's a knowledge that that absolutely God had, right? But what he was saying was that there was also another tree in the garden. And this is one of the things that kind of comes from like Jewish mysticism, is that connecting with that is this tree of light. It helps us recognize that good and evil are one and the same, and that they're just different sides of the same coin. And so that non-duality, science, religion, they're both same. They're both part of the same thing. And we can believe and not believe at the same time. We can be skeptical and religious at the same time. And and both of those have place in our lives. And so that's kind of where I'm coming, that's like a more recent realization on my part, is that it can be both, and it doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah, for sure. And like I have like weird ways of like conceptualizing the concept of God too. Like I was just talking to my wife yesterday about how I feel like God is like this thing that's like constantly like it sounds weird, but like it's constantly doing itself. Like it's always being done in this way. Like it's always creating itself all the time. And
Mhm.
anyway, like that might not make sense to other people, but in my head, it's like very profound and like really
Mhm.
helps like the way that I navigate the world. Um,
Right.
and that's kind of like what matters. This is the story that I'm telling myself, and like that's helpful for me.
Right.
But
And I
yeah,
love too, like because we think in our society in the United States, because we see it so much is that literal truth of the Bible and so on and so forth.
yeah,
And like people have become that like all religions must do that.
yeah,
But the reality is like if you go to certain countries, a lot of the people are atheist. Or they describe themselves as atheist.
hmm,
But then they're going to their temple, their Buddhist temple or whatever, or Hindu temple, and they're engaging in the ritual. And they don't know anything
yeah,
about the religion. They're just engaging in the ritual. That
mm,
engagement in the ritual brings meaning to us. And
right,
so, like, and a lot of times those rituals have stories behind them. And so engaging with the story and enacting the story, even if we acknowledge that, like, yeah, that's not real. That's not true. There's no Amida Buddha who I'm chanting, that I'm chanting Namo Amida Buddha to I take refuge in in Amida Buddha.
yeah,
He's not a real character. And yet I can still orient my life around that and saying his name, saying the Sambutsuge, um, chanting that brings meaning to me,
yeah.
you know?
I like very similarly, like I don't believe in Jesus, right? I'm not a
Mm,
Christian anymore. I've very much distanced myself from that thought process entirely.
mm,
Um, but like if you put me in a room with like me and my guitar and I like jam out with like Christian songs and stuff, like I like put myself in this like
mindset. Yeah.
state, like this like
Yeah.
almost ecstatic state. And I remember I did it like the other week and I just like all these memories of my past, like being on like stages and stuff and like leading
Mm,
like tons of people in work, like these incredible feelings like
yeah.
that I've cultivated and stuff that are connected with this particular deity, like Jesus,
Mm,
right? That like I'm still able to cultivate all of those sensations in my
right.
body.
Yeah.
Um, but like it's from a different perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just it's my nervous system is just set up that way. Like that
Yeah.
kind of it just does something
And
to
I
me.
I
And I wish
love
it kind
that
of wasn't
too.
like that, but that's just how it is. So
I love that too, because and I think that's actually something
yeah,
like I hadn't really considered before, but I love what you said, because one of the things that we do, like, and you probably know this, is in therapy, it's this idea that trauma is stored emotionally.
yeah.
And like a lot of times when situations happen in our lives that are similar, emotionally similar, those
Mhm.
emotions from those emotional memories come up,
Yeah.
and we are now now we're putting them on the current situation, even though and that's when people are like, dude, why are you so freaked out like right now? It's just spilled milk,
Yeah, it's
but
not
it's
about
bringing up
about
something that
everything
happened from our
else.
childhood. But one of the things that I loved about what you just said is that it's not just trauma, it's joy.
Yeah,
It's this idea that, like, when I get on my
mhm,
guitar, I'm reconnecting with the joy that I experienced
yeah,
when I was younger. And
mhm,
even though there came that point where, yeah, I felt that rejection, I felt that betrayal, I felt that anger, resentment, injustice, all of that,
yeah,
I can still connect with that other part of that.
right.
And, and I can do that through that same religious feeling. And I
Yeah,
think that's something that I might start kind of introducing to my clients more, is this idea that it's not just trauma that the body keeps the score, it's
yeah,
joy.
right, yeah, I'm like, I'm getting chills right now because it's
Yeah.
like, um, I refuse to allow myself to access the joy from that part of my life for a long time because of, like, a lot of the bitterness
Mhm.
and stuff I was going through. But, like, so I needed that time. I needed that time to be
Yeah,
bitter and angry and have all those feelings.
and sit in the darkness. Yeah,
Yeah, whatever. But then like when I was ready, like those memories were kind of waiting for me, like with open arms, like, hey, like we're here, like
yeah,
we're ready for you. And like now I know like I have access to all of those feelings. Like that is incredibly powerful, like for me.
yeah, yeah.
Um yeah.
I love too, because it reminds me, and again, this is another story that I use in my therapeutic practice. It's about Nana and the Halupu tree. Nana is like a Sumerian goddess, she's like known as Ishtar in
Mhm.
Babylon. But basically, the story is that she wants to go and meet with a Reshkigal
Okay.
in the underworld, and so she travels down into the underworld, And when she goes, but first, before she goes, she's telling her servant, who's like her most loyal servant, like, you haven't heard from me in like 3 days, come find me. Right?
Right.
He's like, okay, I got you, I got your back. Right? So she goes, and she goes into the gates. Like, there's like several gates that she has to go through, and at each one, the guardians basically remove her royal accoutrements,
Mhm.
her
Oh,
symbols of power,
yeah.
until she gets to, the underworld, and is confronted with Ereshkigal, and she's naked. And
Mm,
Ereshkigal is basically like, how dare you come here thinking that you can confront me in my world, in my kingdom,
yeah.
right? And so she takes her, and to punish her for this, she places her on an iron pike in the middle of
Oh,
the underworld, just leaves her there, right? And so 3 days later, right, her servant is kind of like, okay, I haven't heard from her.
yeah.
So he goes looking for her, and he goes to Ereshkigal, and basically pleads for, for his queen's life. And she says, I'm willing to release her, but only if she sends someone in exchange, to be here in the underworld. And so Inanna agrees to this, comes back out, goes home. When she gets home, she finds her husband is sitting on her throne. And he's like, hey, babe, how's it going? She's like, him. He's the one
Yeah.
that I'm sending in my place. And she grieves it afterwards. She
Yeah.
grieves that loss. But it's
Mm,
similar to your story, which is that,
yeah.
like, yeah, you had to go through this period of like darkness, where
Yeah.
like, and hurt, from having lost this, from everything that had happened in your, in your experience as a religious person. And when you came out, you burned away the
Yeah.
parts that weren't meaningful to you anymore, the
Mhm.
parts that were hurting you. Him.
Yeah.
He's the one I'm sending back,
Yeah.
right? And that's, but embracing the joy of it,
Yeah.
embracing the parts of it that were, that were meaningful to you, that did give you, that are still meaningful to you, the joy. And I
Yeah.
love that, you know.
Yeah. Like, yeah, we're it's like this, and like you said, it's like this has come from like a very compassionate place. Like it was
Mhm.
a lot of compassion in the exploration. Like there was compassion in the decision to even like try to like play worship music again, because it's like a very uh tough thing, you know what I mean, to do or
Mhm.
whatever. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, but like navigating that whole space with compassion rather than, like you said, kind of that like bloated sense of self, like I'm amazing, I
Right.
can handle everything by myself or whatever,
Right.
is like the way to go. And I think that yeah, I hope that we've accomplished our job of like showing how these stories are valuable, and yeah, how spirituality is like super meaningful, like in both of our lives and everything like
Yeah.
that. But yeah, like I don't know if you've is there anything else about maybe like your personal spiritual practice that you'd want to share?
Um, I was thinking, I can't think of anything in particular about like my
Yeah.
own spiritual practice that like, that's, but one of the things that we kind of, was that we kind of touched on in the beginning, but, I don't know that we really fully explored, is that
Okay.
science has a kind of a religious element to it
Oh.
that can be wonderful, and that you can take some of the ideas that are from religion, and apply them to science. So like, as an example, I got into like kind of a coffee shop debate with a professor one
Okay.
time. That was a friend of mine and a friend of my best friends. And initially, I was really kind of flummoxed, because he was kind of saying, he's kind of like coming at me because I was very scientifically minded at the time, and saying like, like, you can't really experience a lot of these things that, come from religion. And I was kind of like, I had to sit with that for a minute, because I didn't know exactly how to respond to it. But the next time we had that conversation, he kind of said a similar thing, like, what can God, what can science say about my connection to, say, like this plant over here? And I said, it can actually say a lot,
Quite a
because
lot.
we all share the same DNA,
Yeah.
and we all come from a from a single
Right.
ancestor. And so we are all part of this biome together, all part of this one world together. And even
Yeah.
further back, you can go into the idea that we were all at one point star stuff.
Yeah.
And so we were, it connects us with the stars. It connects us with the cosmos. It connects us with the beginning of the universe. We're all united. We're all interlinked.
Yeah.
We're all part, we're all one. And that has a sort of religious, awe-inspiring quality to it.
Yeah.
And it also kind of gives a sense of that fragility to it all. And that
Mm.
and kind of also meaning to it, like there's a sort of, we're the culmination of the universe. We're the universe looking at itself.
Yeah. Yeah, like what I was saying. Yeah, like what I was saying earlier.
Yeah.
So what I was gonna say was that so I feel like that is such a natural feeling, and because Christians they monopolize this. I'm not sure. Take advantage of the God-shaped hole type situation. I think that's like a real thing where we like look at plants and there's like something about it, like you're connected in this depth that seems like harder to comprehend. Like when I look as a kid, like used to look up at the stars, like the way that it would make me feel. Like, what is that? Like it has to be something. It has to be, And as a child, I was trained to believe like that feeling of awe immediately was God, like was worshiping God. And like after I kind of let go of that, I realized that it's just a part of it's just built into the world. Like this awe is just built into the way that the world is supposed to be. And so like it's natural to just feel connected to people just because that's the way that it is.
And I love to,
God said it. God said that it has to be this way.
And I love to like a kind of a similar kind of going back to the kind of the beginning of our conversation in Contact, right? There's a line in the film at one point where she meets like the aliens who built them or who kind of sent the message initially, right? And she asks them like, did you so you built this? And they're like, no, we didn't build it. We don't know who did. And she said, and all all the species that you reach out to, they come here. And he's like, no, not all. And she says, why do you do this? And he said, because in all the universe, what we've realized is the only thing that makes the emptiness bearable is each other. And that's part of, I think, that awe, that connection to one another. We can see kind of that divinity in one another and connect with that, whether we want to call it divinity or we want to call it just, community or whatever you want to call it. Like the thing that makes the emptiness bearable for all of us, the thing that fills us with that awe and humility is each other. We're all in this pale blue dot.
No, but really. And I love it. Come full circle, like, and I really do think like being able to look at another person and like see that the aspect of them, like you said, the divinity or like their uniqueness or whatever the word you want to call it. But yeah, being able to look at people like knowing that they are like a part of like this wonderful structure and like treating them with the respect that they deserve. Yeah. Just as like, when we see a plant, we're gentle and careful with it and things like that.
So
yeah.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on your show and for being open to this conversation, because I really did enjoy it.
Oh my gosh, me too. I'm so grateful. I hope that it's helpful. Like I said, I hope that we were able to answer some of this question, and I hope that if you have additional questions, you'll share in the comments below. Awesome. Make sure to like and subscribe and all the things. You can find Brian's contact information on screen and in the comments, in the description box below. Any other closing statements?
I think if y'all also, if you're interested, like, and you want to kind of reach out, you can check out my Psychology Today page. You can also, if you want to kind of see, I also do a lot of play therapy. I have a little YouTube channel called Initiative Play Therapy, where you can kind of see like some of the interventions I use. And again, a lot of it's very narrative based because I like narrative therapy. I think it's the English major in me. I used to be, my bachelor's degree was in English, but
those are both, I'm pretty positive those are both linked in the description below. So definitely check those out.
Yeah. So
yeah.
All righty. Well, Fantastic. Thank you again.
Yeah.
And thank you, everyone who was watching. And thank you, Hollis, for the conversation. It was wonderful talking with you as well.
Yeah. Hollis is the OG. Yeah. All right, cool. Have an awesome day, everyone. Peace and love. I'll see you next time.